All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 47, and we have an amazing treat today. I have like to welcome my guest, Heidi Gill with Urban Solutions. She's local in Denver. We're recording in this in our respective offices and studios, but we're actually like a couple miles apart right now. So, Heidi, I'm going to talk a lot about the market and sort of timestamp this. It's Wednesday, May 4th, 2022. A lot has happened today and oil prices are way up, but I wanted to introduce you and say hello. And all the stuff that I'm going to talk about, you're more than welcome to jump in if you want to chime in on Fed and inflation. Just jump in and interrupt me.
Okay, perfect. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me. And lots to discuss right now. Very,
Absolutely.
very interesting
Absolutely.
times.
Absolutely. So, and the focus of this podcast is really going to be Heidi is based here in Denver. She has a company called Urban Solutions. So we're going to talk about that. And we really want to talk about the state of sort of the Colorado oil and gas market, the Denver Julesburg Basin, and what's sort of happening from a regulatory front. But Heidi is a business owner. She has a lot of employees. And so getting her perspective as a sort of a service company in this space, what's going on, I think is just going to be a fantastic conversation. But with that being said, it is Wednesday, May 4th, 2022. Oil prices right before this were 107.68. So we're pushing this 108. We saw 108 today for WTI. Brent is 110.07. Nat gas is 838. And that number is just driving me crazy. That's way too high for natural gas prices, and I think hitting the consumer on so many fronts. And I'm actually more concerned about natural gas prices from an inflationary standpoint and recession than I am about oil prices. Dutch TTF on $1 MMBTU basis, that's our European benchmark, that's at $32 right now. And I'm adding a metric, and that's the 30-year fixed mortgage rate, and we are almost at 5.6%. And I tweeted this out and put it on LinkedIn, but that 30-year fixed mortgage rate is really serious. And it's not that people can't handle 5.6%. It's the rate of increase, because we were at basically 3% and change in January. And it's that rapid rate of increase that is something that I am, really concerned about with the consumer. And so I think today, and again, you're welcome to jump in at any moment, but today we had Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, come out and had raised interest rates by 50 basis points. And he ruled out a 75 basis point rate hike and basically said would have several consecutive rate increases of 50 basis points. He did emphasize the job market thing, and this is where the mortgage rates get involved, is that a lot of economists came out afterward and even before and said that before he did his question and answer session, is that we're going to have to see unemployment significantly rise, because we're in the 3% change for unemployment, and everyone's saying we're going to have to go to 5% in order to get inflation back in line. So meaning the economy is going to have to soften and people are going to have to start losing jobs, because right now we have one applicant for basically every two for one job posting for every job posting we have like half of an applicant. It's 1.9. It's a 2-to-1 ratio right now. So the problem is that we just don't have enough people to fill these jobs, and that is really problematic. So for every 1.9 job postings, we have one applicant, and that I'd love, actually, from your running a business here in Colorado, that is something I would like to touch on. So I will sort of set this Fed stuff aside, even though it can go on for a long time. But I think that's a nice timestamp here. There's a lot to talk about with Colorado. We had 600,000 barrels a day of oil production, largely coming from Weld County in 2019. We're at 450,000 barrels a day ish right now, still largely coming from Weld County. But COVID really took a big hit on Colorado. But before that, it was, Prop 112, which was defeated. But then it was all the stuff with SB 181, which I'd like to get into. So without further ado, I think maybe, telling us a little bit about what Urban Solutions is. I think a lot of people know you for this, sound walls and sound barriers. And if you're driving out north of Denver and you're seeing rigs, you're seeing these sound walls. And I'm always like, hey, that's probably Heidi's. So, tell us what Urban is. Tell us about how you started starting the business, and we'll get into jobs and inflation and all this nerdy stuff.
Yeah. Great recap of everything that's going on right now. So I'm Heidi, founder and CEO of Urban Solution Group, obviously. And we started out as a predominantly energy service company that specialized in nuisance impacts and social compatibility with oil and natural gas development. So really noise, light, dust, odor, aesthetics, and things like that, and working with the communities and the operators to help mitigate those impacts. And so started Urban about 5 years ago, and we have a patent on a type of sound wall that is by far recognized as really the best product throughout the country in regard to performance, safety, and really mitigating those nuisance impacts. So here and I'll focus on this. So predominantly in the oil and natural gas industry, in the last 2 years, we've really made quite a bit of diversification, doing some work in renewables and helping with those projects. I mean, there's huge opposition against renewable projects as well. And then actually we're doing a lot in the crypto space right now in regards to really similar stuff again, noise issues, with the actual containers and miners. And then also, your public opposition for the project. So Urban now is working throughout the country, and predominantly our stuff outside of Colorado is actually in renewables and crypto. And the majority of the work that we do in Colorado is oil and gas focused. And really that stems from, we have a fleet, we could be on about 30 to 35 drilling rigs at once with our patented product. And we were manufacturing nonstop, and we can go into kind of the inflation piece that we're seeing on the manufacturing side in a little bit. But we shut down the manufacturing line when COVID hit, and we have not started back up again since. So Urban's patented product is fully committed in long-term contracts with the larger operators throughout the state. So really, we are asked to bring our products to other countries, other states throughout the country, but we just don't have any of the demand. And then we keep it here because Colorado really is ground zero for everything that you're talking about in regard to political and regulatory challenges for our industry. So that's a high level of kind of what we do.
That's
we
fantastic.
do a lot in we do a lot in noise engineering, noise modeling. We built a new software, and the new software actually has a really large Colorado regulatory component. So we're launching it here, but then the idea is we'll bring it to other basins as like regulatory creep is inevitable. So we're majority, probably 80% of the market share of sound walls in Colorado is Urban's. And then what we do aside from that is also noise mitigation plans and lots of the engineering that goes into the permits. And that game has completely changed post SB 181. So real quickly, I think that you referenced, Prop 112. The market has been ever evolving. I started Urban in 2017. The politics and the regulations have really been continuously on this roller coaster here in Colorado. So speaking about Colorado specifically, we had Prop 112, which voters, we were able to get past that, but then we had SB 181 that was passed legislatively. So in regard to
pause one just second. So this is where this is a great way to sort of enter this, and we'll get back into your business and stuff. But so just for listeners to understanding, if you're not super familiar with Colorado, Proposition 112 was in 2018. Colorado has a very flexible, easily amendable constitution, so people are always trying to throw stuff onto it. Proposition 112 was basically going to be a very aggressive setback measure within Colorado, and it was defeated. And it was largely defeated. Yes, there was some I think partisanship on the defeated, but it was defeated because it was looked to be economically devastating to Colorado. But then Jared Polis was elected as governor, and he made it very clear, within the first interview on 9 News right after he was elected, that he was not a fan of oil and gas and he was going to regulate it. And then SB 181, which is something, this is where I would like to sort of love your perspective in explaining this, because I know that you've been on the front lines of this. Of SB 181 was sort of really jammed through on the Senate side and doesn't quite unfair and biased, and has had massive ramifications to how the COGCC, the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, how they are actually regulate permits, how the structure of the COGCC, who's on it, and how we actually permit oil and gas wells. So I'd love for you to explain, and I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I know you have a great explanation. I'd love for you to sort of explain this SB 181, when did that start and how did this go through, and what it actually ended up doing? Because I don't think a lot of people are super familiar with it.
Yeah. And so I'm not a political, I don't follow the politics or the sessions quite as closely as some that would speak on this topic. But I am somebody that can understand. Yeah. I am somebody that definitely has opinions on it, and then also can tell you the impact as I see it from how operators are seeing it. And then, obviously we're a service company, but through our customers and how they're seeing it, and we're helping them navigate it. So yes, I think it's historically, Governor Polis has not been an advocate of this industry. He's been pretty outspoken against it. His narrative today, I don't know if you've watched more recently, has shifted that we are open for business, and he wants industry to know that we want to foster oil and natural gas development here. I think that there's lots of reasons maybe why he's changing his tone on how he addresses things now versus pre SB 181. But yeah, I will leave that there. But I do think that what we're seeing is, so SB 181 got pushed through very abruptly. I actually wrote an op-ed on this and said, hey, don't pass this. And not saying that if the regulations in there are proper and they're the way that they need to be passed, fine. But what I had posed to the commissioners is basically said, okay, don't pass this as is. Go ahead and slow down and take 6 pads that would be in different parts of Colorado and put those through these new regulations and get 3 that would be approved and 3 that would be denied. Because the big difference with SB 181, so Colorado is a home rule state, meaning local governments have a lot more control than states that don't have that. So what SB 181 was intended to do was intended to provide more authority to local governments. Now, there's lots of reasoning of why and where this originated. And it was not set in place to like foster oil and natural gas development. It was very different. But then what's different is that now post SB 181, you have, Weld County that is, they decided to really take on and use their authority, under SB 181. And they've had quite a bit of back and forth with the COGCC. And now they have, a memorandum of understanding. But they've said, okay, well, we want to take all of the control and then we're going to process permits the way that we think they should. I think what's really interesting is, and this is all public, but Occidental brought forward 2 locations inside inside Firestone, the local government of Firestone. And those were the first locations ever denied in the state of Colorado. And I think what's interesting is that the town of Firestone approved the permits. So Occidental had gone in front of the board, they did the process, and Firestone approved the permits, and then the COGCC denied them. So I think that we are just starting to see, not only are we passed extremely robust regulations that I think a lot of people are like, how do we even permit and or comply with these? And I think that, when you look at one location now can have up to 21 mitigation plans for different, whether it be a nuisance or compliance issues. And so, 21 really robust plans go into that. There's an immense amount of time and resources that go into, collecting all of those. And so your sheer number of like documents and due diligence on the permit side is so much bigger under SB 181. Then I think that what has been challenging and why, the state has not been processing permits consistently. It seems that the less contentious ones are getting processed. And the way that SB 181 is written is there is a really large, there's a really large element to SB 181 that goes just beyond kind of data and science. It really opened the door and allowed for perception and people's emotions to be part of the formal process. And so we're a company that believes in social compatibility with communities. So we're always at the forefront saying, we need to mitigate and engage the community in these ways. But we really do believe that you can have socially compatible oil and natural gas development near people. Like the tools and the technology do exist. So what we have yet to see is how is the commissioners, when they bring forward a location that's been within 2,000 feet and there are people and they're upset, if an operator meets everything to show, there's a term called substantially equivalent, meaning if they can use technologies and methods to conduct an operation that is substantially equivalent to above the impact of beyond 2,000 feet, it should be approved. So we are not seeing those come through. So I think that's going to be something that that we'll learn a lot more from the state as they begin to process these permits. But we're really early on in this process. The governor and the commissioners are saying, yes, we want to be processing permits, especially with the global narrative right now, and the shift from even like natural gas is bad. Now it's like everything is back to fossil fuels and natural gas are critical. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening. But yeah, that's a little bit of like
Can we
Go ahead.
break out in that? I mean, that's really good color and good commentary, and it brings there's several sort of things I want to unpack within that, and that's that. So for listeners also, is Firestone was where we did have the home explosion, which was in 2017, which was a very big deal, and a super big deal. And there's not a single person in the oil and gas industry that condones that, and there's a whole. I actually have a whole separate podcast on that from several years ago that folks can check out. But that was a really big deal. And so when we mentioned Firestone, I think that comes to mind for a lot of folks. And partly but this SB 181 did sort of, it did enforce or add a setback rule into it, correct? And then additionally did it also, because there's two things, that it also reformed the COGCC, or that was separate, or it was part of it, because the reforming of the COGCC, changing up the people that are in it and not having less oil and gas people in it, and also that their job was not actually the premise or emphasis of the COGCC, to my knowledge, is no longer to actually approve permits, but to go through the approval of permits. So the end goal is not to actually get the permits approved. It's to decide whether or not these are environmentally conscious, all these things, which really changes from a legalistic perspective. It's makes sense why these are so held up, because there's no incentive to actually approve them.
Yeah. And again, I'm sure someone's going to watch this and say, like, that's not the right word. I'm not a regulatory professional. But I can tell you the basic concept. Yes, they basically changed up how the commission was. They professionalized the commission, and definitely opened that up to, it's a paid position where they have, some folks that are not massively pro oil and gas. I don't think they're going to say that they're anti. And then, but you have different seats now that are filled that aren't just filled from all oil and gas people. So the oil and gas industry holds one seat. Now,
and how many? There's 7 people in it, right?
I think there's 5.
Okay, 5.
Five,
So
and then
one seat is just, that's
yes, yeah. And then so that was part of it. And then it used to be that the mission of the COGCC was to foster oil and natural gas development. And again, I might not get the words perfect. But now, the biggest element that you'll hear people talk about for SB 181 is, protection of health, safety, welfare, and that is, the premise now and the charge. So it's how do you, process, approve, and or deny permits through that framework and that lens of protecting the public health, safety, welfare, and environment.
okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, so, most folks in the industry know that this was pushed through really rapidly. Even folks who weren't paying attention to it, it was very quick. And so the implications for people, I think most people in Colorado probably don't have an idea that if you're driving north of Denver, you're going to start seeing pump jacks and rigs. And we actually have a massive amount of crude oil. Like I said before, we had 600,000 barrels a day of crude oil, largely being produced from roughly 6,000 horizontal wells in Weld County. These are wells that were horizontally drilled and fracked safely. And this is just it's a bit mind blowing, I think, for a lot of folks. And something I've always paid attention to is we have some of the most stringent emissions requirements. We've had them previously. We have some of the most stringent emissions and regulatory environment in the country. I was in London at Chatham House, I think in 2017, and I heard the chief economist of the International Energy Agency was referencing Colorado emission standards. And it's for good or bad, I always thought they were a little bit too onerous, because I saw the regulatory environment going in the wrong direction. And I think the industry has, struggled to sort of balance that sort of balancing act. But you are literally right in the middle of it. Your business in, putting up these sound walls, and which, they didn't exist. When did we start putting up these sound walls, and what's the impact to these communities and the environment has to be significant. I've been on rigs, and I've been on on frac locations and on rigs where sound walls are up. And it definitely has, even just for lights, all kinds of mitigation influences. If you're near these homes and communities, it has to be beneficial. And I always, I don't know if people realize how quickly we drill wells now. Rigs are not on location for 2 months. We can have workover rigs and everything, and I still see sound walls with those workover rigs, which is great. But it's not like these rigs we take a month to drill a well, especially in Colorado. These are shallow. We drill these really fast. We spud to TD these in 3 days. And then we also frack wells pretty fast as well. We can do that, but your sound walls are providing mitigation for all of that stuff. So maybe you can just offer feedback and color on that, of exactly when this started and how did they work, and then we can get into the components and inflation and all that nerdy stuff.
Yeah, so the sound walls actually originated out in like the Barnett, I think in, like maybe 2010 or sometime around there. So there were companies that were using them for urban drilling in the Barnett before they made their way here. I think that now if you have a home within 2,000 or even, sometimes even 2,500 feet, you know, other than leave our community, it's the one thing you can put up that someone can actually see, right? And I think you made a good point. It doesn't just tackle noise; it helps with light mitigation, dust, proximity, aesthetics, different things like that. But there is, Colorado, not only aside from all of your points on the emissions and air monitoring, we have the most stringent air regulations in the country. We already did, and now they're even more stringent. Some would even say certain things that are in there don't even make sense of what we're looking at, and we're really preliminary. We have some studies here that influence policy, which now the people that were part of those studies said, hey, we had no business using that study to influence policy in the way that we
Yep.
have. So, and one thing is you had mentioned the term setback. So the COGCC does not see the 2,000 foot as a setback. They see it, and is my understanding, they see it as like a siting requirement more of. You can have locations within 2,000 feet from people, but you have to get waivers and do all these different things or meet this substantially equivalent concept. And I think that that's where we're really going to see how things flush out. And again, in the op-ed that I wrote, I basically said, don't pass these yet. Show us 6 locations, 3 that would be approved and 3 that wouldn't. So we're not all confused when these things come out. And that obviously no one listened to that. But so anyways, we are now in the spot where we're really trying to get, not only are we getting guidance documents from the COGCC on how things are going to be enforced and regulated, but those are coming out all the time. So it's like a moving target. And so everyone's trying to keep up and learn. So all of that stuff. So there is a large noise data component that the sound walls help meet, because Colorado also has a very stringent noise regulation. It has a very, very mature noise regulation compared to other states throughout the country. So the walls help from a compliance standpoint, but then they do really have a large social impact as well, I would say, in a good way in regards to mitigating the community or mitigating impact to the community beyond just the noise aspect. And so we usually install the walls right after the pad is constructed, and then the walls stay until the wells are, you're through flow back and you're turning over to production. It really mitigates, everything from, pipe delivery, drilling, it's the whole kit and caboodle that it mitigates throughout like the life of getting that well, up and going. And then even when you have then a well that's producing for 20 or 30 years, there's new regulations and mitigations that you have to do on the production facility side and the compressor station side, which we do as well.
And I think it's important for people to realize, like, I was on a location with Liberty in November, and we drove up to it, and we checked in and everything, and so there's lots of security measures, and it had sound walls and everything, and they were fracking. But I mean, when you're driving out, the noise was, there was a little bit of noise you could hear on the if the frac side was going, but we were hearing louder noise from the road because we were literally next to the highway. So there was and not that probably offset some of the noise, but the reality is, like, noise, everything you can do to sort of contain it. And now obviously Liberty has quiet frac fleets, and those help as well. So lots of noise mitigation when you're near these homes. But I also think it's important is that folks in Colorado and probably folks outside of it have paid attention to the housing market and stuff know that Colorado is a booming state in terms of just development, right? So when we talk about mile high, a mile is 5,280 feet. So when we are talking about a 2,000 foot, and I still call it a setback, and I put my opinions and analysis, because I think really appreciating the stringency of these regulations and the evolution of them, it has impacted business. It has impacted how many rigs are in the state, how many operators are here, M&A. There's a myriad of implications from an economic business standpoint. And so Polis now saying that they're interested in rah on oil and gas now, but you have to actually do it. And it's just like the administration, in my opinion, saying, yes, we want to export natural gas. You have to build the pipelines and do it. And in Colorado, this is something where you can say, Polis can say all he wants, but if they're going to back it up on a regulatory framework of, permits have to actually get approved, which has driven so many companies to do all this consolidation of just buying permits. But this 2,000 feet, if you're putting that in perspective, it's not it's not that far. And if you drive around Colorado, the development has been significant because people have wanted to move here. And you've had a lot of housing developments, build near oil and gas facilities. And yes, I mean, there were things early on, especially with Firestone, that were not done properly. And that was an accident that should have never happened. But I mean, largely now it's just it's a reality of having lots of people and having this oil and natural gas production. I mean, in Colorado, when you're producing 600,000 barrels of oil from a very small area, it is a meaningful contribution to global oil and natural gas production. And we're producing almost 3 BCF a day, 3 billion cubic feet per day in Colorado, again, largely from these wells. And that's a meaningful contribution as well. And this production is, I mean, so when you drop that a couple 100,000 barrels a day production, I mean, Colorado is producing more than small OPEC players. I mean, so it's just it has a really significant ramifications, and it is a state with extremely stringent regulations. So the emission stuff, everything's sort of, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but buttoned up to a large regard. So where you can like move forward, which just seem, like when you can move people, I always like moving people up to the bar as opposed to moving the bar lower. And I think this is an example of that, is sort of, okay, tell us what the regulations are and let us meet it. But if you're going to continue to change them or tweak them or morph them, this seems to me like, and all I hear from clients and I hear from, on operators and midstream and everything, it's the question is always, and the private equity and the investor side is always, where is the trajectory of Colorado? I mean, because they just can't sink their teeth into it. Investors can't, when they know that, can we get another permit? So it's just sort of, we have the permits we have now, and we pray, and they need to be as real as possible, or good permits, because people don't know if we can do anything past that. So it's like, we drill up all these permits and then are we done?
Yeah. No, all really good points. And I think that one comment on, one comment on, and I'm going to try not to get us too far down a tangent here.
That's fine.
Unless we change consumption patterns, the renewable goals that politicians have put forward are pretty much bullshit. So until we as consumers start to change what we're consuming and how we're doing it, doesn't mean just because we ban it in one spot, we're importing it from other areas. And people just really don't understand this concept. And so it's like, if you do believe in climate change, then great. We want to be doing we want to be drilling it here for all of the environmental protections that we've talked about, because places that we're importing don't hold the environment on the same level that we do here in Colorado and that we do here in the US. The other thing is that every single time that we're importing stuff, from, again, Russia or Saudi Arabia, we're supporting like massively suppressive cultures. So I really struggle with, the narrative that has been going around in regard to renewables. And don't get me wrong, we believe in a completely diverse, or I believe in a completely diverse energy future. We are going to need all different forms of energy, and it's a pie chart, and those are going to fluctuate throughout the course of time. Do we want to see transition to cleaner fuel sources? And of course, like everybody wants that, but we have to be realistic about how we're going to get there. And so when consumers, when we make and we vote, and again, the voters voted it down, but then when a politician comes in and does what we did, until Polis decides to start regulating, you can only have access to X amount of oil or X amount of natural gas for what you're consuming. It doesn't matter. We can still go buy whatever we want, and then we're supporting suppressive cultures elsewhere.
Right. So, and that's exactly what's happened all over the entire world, and exactly what's happened there. So,
so I don't want to get us too far down the rabbit hole there, but I do think it's worth noting. I rounded up $10 million in the private markets to start Urban, and we are looking at, some other strategic growth partnerships now. But I know what it's like to have investors, and I know what it's like to have investors that are concerned about an asset that's tied. And again, we're not tied just to Colorado, but we are very much so Colorado focused right now in regard to our patented product. So that is something that, everyone's like, your Urban's completely sold out. You are undersupplying all of your customers. Why are you not manufacturing? And I'm like, until I see a consistent approval of permits flowing out of the COGCC, we likely won't start up again. So we need to see this. The governor and even if you're to say, okay, forget everything that happened, you are saying that this state is open for business now, start showing us the permits. They need to come out. They need to come out consistently. I think that you summed up the M&A activity really well that's happening here. That type of consolidation, to be able to comply with these regulations is extremely expensive. And so I think that We did see massive consolidation here in the DJ. I think it's going to continue, and that's both on the operator and the vendor side. But yeah, for us to start that manufacturing lineup again, which by the way, continually supported 28 labor jobs
Yep.
For 2.5 years. We need to see consistency in permits. And obviously there's considerations with, commodity price, and we had to come back from the oil war and everything like that. But right now our holdup is the confidence that we have in how the COGCC is going to start processing permits. And then what is that going to look like, to your point, for the life of the next 5-10 years?
Well,
I do think now.
I mean, that has huge it's a great point that I kind of want to dive into, because it has huge implications. I mean, lots of folks don't realize that. I mean, a few years ago in the Powder River Basin, people were trying, when it was really hot in 2018, people were trying to sell permits as a wells almost, and the value was crazy. But I don't know if a lot of folks realize in Colorado, because of this, we're not steadily, having these permits. I mean, we are seeing acceleration of drilling activity in the DJ Basin as a whole. There's 15 rigs. There's 12 in Colorado. You have,
but that's majority of historical permits or DUCs.
Exactly.
Yep.
But companies then would all this consolidation, and I'm giving this for listeners. I know that you know this, but I mean, all this consolidation has really been buying permits, and there's quality of permits as well. I mean, truthfully, you should be buying. I mean, companies that want to sell should really be drilling. They should actually really be doing the verticals and doing the conductor pipe and setting the conductor pipe and doing your 2,000-foot verticals, just like a surface casing rig. Because then, to my knowledge, then it's basically a well, and it's basically in some stage of production, and therefore, when you're buying that, one, the company has to sink cost into actually doing it, but you're buying something that's very stable, right? That you can go actually drill that, and that can't be taken from you from the government. So this is, I mean, it's just a unique and unprecedented place where it's also really good acreage. I mean, from a technical geologic rock perspective, production, these are not monster wells. They don't produce 1,000 barrels a day, but they consistently produce the same, like we're talking IPs of 300 to 200 to 400 initial production rate. They decline, but they're shallower wells. They're easy to drill. These are, I mean, literally, it's probably lower than that. Spud to TD in less than 3 days. I mean, the lateral lengths have not increased substantially, which probably will, especially as things get more cumbersome. But to your point, I say this in a lot of podcasts, and as an economist, it's always, you need stability and predictability, especially in the regulatory, like in anything in business, but particularly in regulations. You have to know the line of sight on how to do stuff. And this actually gets into your point on renewables. And I love that you made the comments on how urban sees it. And I'm not nearly as a fan of renewables as other people are, mainly because some of them they just don't make enough money. We have so much inflation that's going to them now. And I think a lot of them are not realistic. There is a lot of hype around them, and companies are very, very focused on doing it, but they don't know how to do it. But the thing is, with ESG, this is a real ESG problem. I mean, I was listening to Diamondback's call yesterday, and they made a comment about, I mean, they opened up with talking about the war in Ukraine, and then they were talking about giving money back to shareholders, and they were keeping production flat, and then they were talking about the renewables and the ESG stuff. And I thought, not producing enough oil and gas is an ESG problem. We are, putting, billions of dollars of capex to renewables that produces a lower BTU output, a lower energy output, and not having enough energy for consumers to use is a really ESG problem globally, because people don't have enough energy and inflation is through the roof. And Colorado is just in a really unique crux of that. So I know that was another tangent, but I'm curious, as you're thinking, you're saying this, that, hey, we've got to see line of sight on permits increasing or something. What are you hearing on that, and how do you feel about it? I mean, is it sort of, this is just going to continue to percolate, or is the signs that the governor's saying, hey, we are open for business? Is there some signaling coming down that's saying, hey, we're going to have to prove this because Colorado needs jobs, and this is a workforce, and this could be really beneficial to Colorado, especially if the economy starts to decline. Oil energy could actually stay relatively flat, which would be really, really good for Colorado.
Yeah, so I think that everything that we're hearing from the governor's office is that that they want to see permits being processed and Colorado's open for business. Same thing with some of the commissioners. That is, if you have conversations with them, especially more recently, that is what they are attempting to do. So again, I want to believe that, and we will see. And I hope that permits start flowing out of the COGCC steadily. What I will say is there's also a whole nother consideration so Urban's core focus is we are pro-business near communities and people. So in the US is becoming a lot more like Europe when business in general, whether it's oil and gas or renewables or crypto, it doesn't matter. A grocery store,
Yep.
it's
NIMBYism.
becoming more and more challenging to conduct and permit and get the legal rights to be able to have a business inside and near communities. And it all comes back to the fundamental concept of people want access to everything with none of the impacts.
Yep.
And we all are very privileged in what we think we should have to deal with around us. So we all want access to it. We want it affordable. We want it cheap. We just don't want it near us. That is not so, to Governor Polis or anybody, we see just as much opposition for a wind and solar farm as we see for an oil and gas location.
Absolutely.
We see it's we're a company that has really been forged from the fire in this really challenging environment here in Colorado that's rapidly evolving. The reason why now we're traveling all throughout the country and we're doing this is because there isn't very many companies out there at all that make technical decisions through a social lens. So we have the technical industrial experience to know the equipment and intimately understand what is going to be the impacts of specific types of equipment. Then we also are very, socially aware, socially minded. And so we understand that every single community is different. So that is really what Urban does. And we've been doing that for the oil and natural gas industry, but now we're doing it we've had solar projects denied. We've had crypto projects denied or data hosting, facilities denied. And so it's again, this narrative that oil and gas is doing all these awful things. It's happening everywhere. People want access to everything with none of the impacts. And the truth is that we're a company that believes you need to be prudent in how you're planning. You need to follow your legal license. Everyone uses the term social license in terms of engaging with the community. It's no longer social license. That's bullshit. You engage with the community. It is your legal license. You will not get your ability to operate. I don't care, again, if you're oil and gas, if you're wind and solar, or if you're crypto, unless you engage the community. Right. And so it's really fascinating to see over the course of the last year how much we've expanded because of this one topic. So I'm curious, it will be interesting to see, folks like Governor Polis and other areas where they've been so laser focused on oil and gas being the problem, and how is that same mentality now going to show itself as other industries start to be held up with similar opposition?
I bet your head was exploding, because I've talked about this a ton in the podcast. I talk about it a ton with clients and just in businesses that I always talk about, the not in my backyard NIMBYism. It's really, really real for wind and solar. And I mean, I have a lot of issues with, and I bang on the China thing on every podcast. It's very serious of how much wind and solar is coming from China, and that it comes from forced labor and lots of issues. So when we talk about social license and we talk about ESG, it's just, I poke a million holes into it because it drives me bananas when we are talking about building all this stuff out. But I always hearken this back to, signing of the Paris Climate Accords by the Biden administration was a big deal, but also the first executive order 14008 on climate change, which was a big push to, green up the grid and reduce emissions drastically, which means you would have to take wind and solar would basically have to cover every, square inch of available land roughly in the US everywhere. And we know from, if you know wind and solar folks in Colorado, and you know them more intimately than I just know the business leaders of, it is hard to permit this stuff. And it reminded me of, I knew terminal operators on the East Coast when I was working in DC, and they were board members. It was Global Partners. I remember talking to them, and we would just have conversations with various terminal operators and refineries, and we're talking about ethanol. And lots of folks on the East Coast were pro ethanol, and they wanted to reduce the gasoline and the gasoline pool, and it was green and it was wonderful. Ethanol is made from corn. It's probably not that great for the environment. You shouldn't be using food for fuel, but whatever. They wanted ethanol. You have to rail ethanol. So this was like before the crude by rail controversy and everything, but you have to rail this ethanol. And it was amazing how the people on the East Coast did not want ethanol in their communities because it was explosive and they didn't want a rail car blowing up. And it's like, these are the same people that are advocating to have ethanol in the gasoline pool, but they don't want any other communities. So this whole not in my backyard thing, it makes it, especially for this grand energy accelerated transition that everyone wants to do, which is largely underpinned by wind and solar. If you can't, mine that, this is let alone just building the transmission lines, which we don't do on a regular basis. And I mean, that the wind project from Wyoming to California has been held up for a decade of getting the transmission lines through. So your business, I mean, I feel like that's if the business can even do anything, but it's very valid and relevant. I'm sure you're not the only one doing stuff like that, but it's just so serious of that. It doesn't matter, if it's renewables or if it's oil and gas. It is literally, like you said, it is a grocery store. It's an everything that you have to deal with this. And I think people do, consumers, and especially with these, I'd bet against the energy transition in a lot of different ways, from understanding, not that I don't believe in all of the above strategies, but that from an energy equivalent standpoint and a cost basis. And actually, from a mitigation standpoint, I mean, when we're drilling, completing these wells, it's underground. We're done. Like, there's a lot of things you can do above ground that has a low footprint, and wind and solar tend to not have this lower footprint, but it's just it's a big deal. So these mitigation efforts and this not in my backyard are something really important to consider, of just even how you're going to progress the economy and infrastructure bills, whether you're building out solar and wind, whether you're building out transmission lines, even just upgrading the grid as is. There's all these things that are huge. And I imagine if you're, you probably know Colorado really, really well. So, trying to increase, wind and solar here seems like it's going to be a battle. And I imagine even elsewhere. I mean, you could go to Wyoming and do wind and solar, but I mean, it's probably a battle there as well. I mean, it's probably easier because you have more people, but you have to be where you have less people.
Yeah, and all great points. And it really is a battle everywhere. I mean, there are moratoriums across the country that are on wind and solar right now. So, that isn't new. In the last few years, there's been moratoriums in lots of different areas. It's interesting because a lot of times it will be in areas where they have these aggressive renewable transition goals. So I do think that, to your point, yeah, I mean, the not in my backyard thing is happening everywhere. And I think that really what's going to be brought into the conversation more is going to be on the regulators. And I was giving a talk 2 weeks ago at a conference that was tailored towards educating local governments on oil and gas in general. And it's a great conference every year. And it basically talked about, we're a company that helps with the mitigation side of things, obviously, but we also have built a software that helps with kind of quantifying the human variable of your operation. And then you're able to overlay your operations on top of quantifying this human data element. But it is something that if you're going to be doing a project anywhere, you really need to have an intimate understanding at a grassroots level of the people that are surrounding your operation. You need to be strategic. You need to be well thought out. The other thing is that I think that for all of the regulators out there, fellow regulators that are having to navigate and be the ones to approve and, to approve and or deny stuff, every single person that is in those roles right now, you better be prepared to not win Mrs. or Mr. Congeniality. And that's not your job. Like, your job is, if you have a regulatory environment and you have a regulatory framework, and business brings forward an application that's compatible with those regulations, no matter what, you are always going to have human opposition against a project. And so for whether it's oil and gas or solar or a grocery store or a bar, if you're on a planning commission and you could be at either a local level or, on a state agency, you absolutely could have a completely very well thought out idea that meets all of the regulation, and you're still going to have heartfelt mothers up there crying, about different stuff, and you can't discredit them. But people that are in the regulatory environments need to realize, like, you're not going to be beloved by everybody. That's just not like that. That's not feasible for you being able to hold that position to the integrity which is required of people that are in those positions.
Absolutely.
So I do, I'm very, very grateful for the folks that go into those positions. I know it's extremely challenging, but I think that that's what we're going to see, especially here in Colorado, is as operators bring forward these insane innovations in technology and process. I mean, this industry is so incredible with how we innovate. The quiet fleet is a great example of that innovation. If we had said in the regulations, 6 years ago, okay, we have to have a soundwall on every pad, Chris Wright never would have invested that amount of money in the downturn to develop the quiet fleet. Yep. So you have people that are willing to rise to the occasion to meet these new regulatory environments. And really, no matter what, there's always going to be some type of opposition. So as a country, we are going to be seeing this interface between business and the communities. And I think it's a contention that we're just starting to see. And it's a contention rooted really in privilege and the NIMBY we
Right.
want it, but just not here.
And do you just, a quick short thing, and I really want, as just a business owner, your perspective in your business, the ability to, I mean, it was mentioned today on analysts and stuff talking about the Fed before and after in comments of onshoring. We already are starting to see a lot more onshoring because of all the issues going on with China, which are really, really vast and severe. And I'm curious as to your manufacturing side, if any exposure there and how that's impacted. But this onshoring in general, even then with NIMBYism and just saying, so manufacturing centers and stuff, that's great, but building out businesses and everything there's serious aspects to that if it's in a new spot. But it always makes me get back to the basics of this, is that if you really want wind and solar, I'm all for it if you're going to mine for it yourself. And I just don't see the democratic world. I don't see the US, Canada, or Europe mining heartily for the components that go into batteries and solar in the polysilicon, because this is very intensive. Mining is one thing. So new approvals for mines are really hard. And then two, it's the processing. I mean, we have extremely stringent we have the highest NOx, nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide SOx regulations in the world, some in the world. And so our pollutant, standards are extremely high. So the ability to actually, and then processing the rare earth minerals is extremely environmentally intensive. It's why it's done predominantly in China, because they don't have these regulations, and they have all kinds of issues downstream of this. But it just makes me think of, from your business perspective, I mean, we're talking about small wind and solar projects, maybe not small, maybe big, and Bitcoin mining that can't even get past. So let alone mining for huge things of stuff that we need, stuff that everyone, nickel, cobalt, and copper, all this stuff, but then actually processing it just seems like it is not something that we would have to have a massive shift, and it would take decades, if not longer.
Yes, I agree. I think that, and I don't know, as much on the macro scale as you do intimately about this, it sounds like, but everyone knows what goes into batteries and where we source, lots of stuff that comes out, like of the Congo and in different things where we also have a ton of human rights considerations and
Absolutely.
things like that. But to look at, again, taking, bringing that to the US, getting it permitted, finding the area. I mean, you're talking about a massive, aside from having access to all the minerals that we would need, right? You're looking at a project that would take an extraordinary level of buy-in to pass, depending on where it is geographically throughout the United States, obviously. So yes, I do think that I do see that as a very challenging thing to pass, especially if it's near people, right?
Exactly.
And then even if it's not near people, it is still going, and really stuff of certain capacity shouldn't be near people. But at the end of the day, I do think that we are just making it substantially more challenging for any business, nothing to the size of some of the mining facilities and capabilities that you're talking about. We're making it extremely challenging to do business here in the US. So when you look at, the conversation of dialogue of oh, bring it all back here, you're like,
right.
How's that going to really mechanically work?
And your point on legalities, I think people, legal precedent is huge. And so I think, regulations and you can change stuff, but legal precedent, especially in some of the stuff, does matter. But I think I want to loop. I know we're heading up on 50 minutes here, and I know we want to keep this within an hour. And Heidi is an exceptionally busy and important woman in Denver. She's very hard to pin down, so her time is valuable. So we're gonna keep this tight. And so the rigs and speed in Colorado, this is something from a business standpoint I think about from oil and gas. And I truly, as you do, I mean, I there are a lot of aspects of the DJ that I just love. I mean, from a rock perspective, and Liberty started here. And I mean, we have some great, industry leaders actually here in Colorado, some of the better ones actually, I think. And more, we do need, Chris Wright and I always talk about this, but we need more leadership in the oil and gas space to really actually talk about ESG in the right way, and to lead in the space, public companies and private companies. But in Colorado, we have this. We've had so much consolidation, and I do not think we have enough leadership from Colorado operators to really talk about the stuff we're talking about, and to really take it forward into why oil and gas production in Colorado matters, and why it matters everywhere. But I mean, we have Civitas, which was formerly Extraction, which has bought a bunch of companies. PDC has bought Great Western. I mean, we've had all this consolidation, and then you look at the permit chart, and you can see, I mean, it's big companies. Nickel Road has a lot of permits. I mean, we see this sort of the permits that are there, and then sort of like as you're looking at it, you're like, these are the permits, right? If we don't get any more permits, this is what's going to be drilled. But at these prices, we should also see an acceleration of drilling those permits. I mean, we absolutely should. I mean, at these prices, I would, people need to be hedging at these prices, and they need to drill the crap out of this stuff, because I do not think we're going to end the year at $100+ oil. There's lots of stuff geopolitically that could happen, but from a demand perspective, there's nothing in the global economy that is saying it's going up, right? So for a demand perspective, the global economy is in pain. So I think it's just, and I don't think it's going to devastate the oil and gas industry by any means, but let's just pretend it's sort of $80. Regardless, I mean, Colorado oil and gas producers should be accelerating drilling. And to your point, if you're saying, hey, I can't add and build out more, and I'm sold out now, and I can't build out more, sound walls, and I want to touch on the manufacturing and people side, and if you're having issues on inflation there, but what happens then? I mean, so they will just not have these sound. I assume that people are going to want to drill this stuff. They're wanting to drill this stuff now. They want to add a couple rigs, but from an inflationary standpoint, if they can't get the frac fleet, if they can't get all these components, we have chemical issues, sand issues, you sort of name it. Less so in the DJ and the Rockies. We're not experiencing the same levels of inflation you're seeing in the Permian Basin, but we still have it. So, I mean, I know I just threw a lot at you, but I'm really curious from a business perspective of saying, hey, we're sold out for the sound walls, but you're probably seeing the same. That you're going to have an increase in drilling activity. How are you thinking about that and navigating it? And separately, even if you wanted to build them out now, could you? I mean, from an inflationary manufacturing standpoint, is that possible?
Yep. So just to manufacture right now, we would be about at least 30% more to manufacture, cost to manufacture. And again, it's just millions and millions of dollars to keep that the manufacturing line going once we start. So it's something that we either fully commit to it for a while, or we really don't do it, because we don't do small spurts. So I think that there's a ton of considerations around that piece, and how challenging it is to find trade jobs, and especially on the labor side. Those are all really challenging things that are obviously driving up, or contributing to the increased cost of manufacturing. So going back really fast. So what we want to see is, we want to see consistent permit approvals at the state, and to get some assurance that operators will be able to keep 1 or 2 drilling rigs going for the year. So I think that, yes, the price of oil has gone up, but can an operator do they have enough permits to bring on a full second rig to keep a rig going the whole time? A lot of times, especially the majors, they don't just bring a rig for one time. Right. So they want to be able to keep it for a while. So I think that is why we're not seeing this rapid, let's just flood the gates with bringing back, all these rigs. As I think that there's an element of, how many permits do you have right now? To your point, are they good permits, and can they be drilled? And then also, is it something that then consistently, we are looking for some type of consistency on the development, or at least a lot of the majors are. So I think that is a very real thing. And then I think across the board, at Urban, we're really fortunate, especially for like our full team in-house. We're still a small company. We massively incentivize our employees. We're, flexible work environment. Like we're able to attract talent, and we've been really fortunate that even in this job market, we're still getting really solid candidates. Where we're seeing more of a challenge is on like the labor side, right? So you're installing these giant sound walls. It's really challenging and hard work. You're outside in the elements. It's freezing in the winter. It's a sauna in the summer. And so it's really challenging to find and fill those positions. So we are seeing, an increase of what we need to pay to be able to maintain people that we have. And so that is definitely a real struggle. I think that for us, a lot of our investors are, they've made the decision to double down. They wouldn't have invested in a company like Urban if they didn't believe in the long-term play for the industry. So we're not opposed to it. I think that what is different from a vendor perspective is, we always tell operators, in the way that we do stuff now, is like, we're not interested on bidding on a pad. Not of interest to us. We're interested on bidding on a drilling program for a year.
Right.
And so
these are deep operator relationships.
Exactly. And it's also, though, like the vendor dynamic, especially here in the DJ, is very different. Like there are critical vendors that you have to have, because to your point, if you have a permit but you don't have the sound wall, we're not the only company that does sound walls, but in the DJ, we are who people would like to pick.
Right.
And that's again for safety, performance, how we work with, the team, the product's caliber, all of that. So we really approach it, and this is how we were able to contract our entire fleet so early on, is we approached it as, we're not here to talk about one pad. We're not your vendor for that choice. We're here to talk about drilling programs and partnerships. And so I think that what we're going to see in the DJ is a lot more relationships like that. Just like you've had consolidation on the operator side, you're seeing consolidation on the vendor side. And the truth is that you have, like, a Liberty is a very, very critical vendor that needs to be here in the DJ. That is somebody that's very different than if there's not 10 Liberties out there, right? So operators are starting to view and starting to shift some of the operator to vendor relationships into stuff that's slightly more non-traditional. But I think that is a huge testament to showing how operators are willing to, the lengths that they're willing to go to be able to continue to operate in the basin. They're doing things now that are much more unconventional than what they were doing before. But really, I think that as you see, fewer operators, you're going to see fewer vendors. And again, going back to your points about leadership and advocating for the industry and stuff like that, all of that matters now in the vendor side just as much as it does the operator side.
Absolutely. And those are really, really valid points. And I'm jotting down some notes because there are a couple things of that. So one clarification, and we're going to close this up with sort of this. I want to talk a little about the progression potentially of lateral lengths, but lastly, the comment you just made, which is fantastic, about the importance of having vendors in the state and businesses in the state. And if you don't have, or if the state is not fostering an environment for them to be there, they're going to, I mean, you could see vendors leave because they have to go elsewhere and the demand is elsewhere. And I mean, I don't know if people always appreciate that folks in the Rockies have been competing with the Permian since the Permian flipped in 2014, when their vertical rig count and their horizontal rig count finally flipped, and they had more horizontal rigs drilling than vertical rigs. And I mean, this is an evolution that people have not, a lot of folks in and outside the industry don't always really appreciate, is this competition with where frac fleets and rigs and everything go, and it impacts pricing and it impacts availability and impacts just the ability to do business. But when you work with an operator and you're putting up a sound wall, the operator's paying you, and then they're doing it for the life of, this is when the rig is drilling, and then we have our frac company? Or are you working also with those vendors, or is it strictly with the operator and the timing that the activity is going on those pads?
Yeah, so we work strictly with the operator. We're, majority of the time, if you see a Liberty fleet, you probably see an Urban wall. If you see an Urban wall, it's probably a Liberty fleet.
Mm-hmm.
So we work very closely with them, and we have great relationships with, the vendors that are out there, but we contract directly with the operator, because really, right, you have, say, Precision's there for drilling, and then you've got Liberty there for frac. It's completely different. And those are two really broad scale operations with two totally different, really reputable vendors that for us, it's that the operator secures the wall, puts it up, and then they're mitigating throughout, regardless of which vendors are there, right? It's the operator's responsibility to meet the compliance. And then it's the fact that we hit so many different stages of the development that our product is used to mitigate.
Yep. No, that's excellent clarification. And that's great. And it was just something I was thinking. I was actually looking up lateral lengths and well additions. And, Colorado was no different. DJ was no different than every other basin that, well additions really dropped in 2020, but they've been muted. And I haven't actually seen the lateral length side, which is something, we've seen. The average lateral length in Midland right now is 13,000 foot. So incredible progress on drilling speed and efficiency. Frac guys like Liberty, everyone has done a really good job about, really pushing this forward. And impressively, we are still you can actually take all the wells in all the major basins in the US, and you can put them on a normalized decline curve. And year over year, we're still eking out gains. And it made me think something about the DJ on these lateral lengths, is that we should see them increase, but I don't actually know if we will, because you have to have more, yes, we have consolidation in the space, but the consolidation is about existing permits, not about acreage. And so, yeah, you blocked up acreage, which would be great if, we were able to permit, we would see longer laterals, and we would see, enhanced and different production techniques. I mean, we should, quite frankly, right now at $100 oil, this upspacing thing should be kind of thrown out a bit. We should be downspacing a bit at these oil prices, because it makes total sense. So that was just a nerdy anecdote that I was thinking about. But
no, I think it's a valid point.
And that impacts your business and how you think about it. So I appreciate all that feedback. And then the last thing on the Polis thing on, I was thinking about is you were talking very eloquently and explaining, these service companies and these businesses. And, I think Heidi and I are both fans, and really anyone who knows Chris Wright is a huge fan of him because he is a true leader in the space. But they are a primary vendor. I mean, they're based here in Denver. They're a big frac provider here in Denver, but they are obviously big in all these other basins. And they're just one example of many companies, and yourselves included. I mean, sound walls are a little bit different places, but any vendor, any service company being based in Denver is really difficult to say, hey, we're based in Denver and this is our core of our business. Now you could be in the powder and stuff, but you really need an office down in Casper and North Dakota. And so it's something that, if Jared Polis needs to, listen to the podcast, and I know some of the former governors that probably should, you and I probably know them as well. The thing to listen to as well is that, hey guys, you really do have to have a regulatory environment that is going to start permitting and doing these approvals, because you're going to have businesses that will potentially leave the state because they can't see the path forward, right? They don't have a roadmap to accelerate business or just even maintain it. And that's really hard for the operators that do have the permits, that have stacked these up and say, I've got to do something with it, because then they're going to be competing with the service providers and vendors. And it's just really problematic, and especially a business that, and that's why Colorado is just so unique in that it's, hey, we have these permits and then we're doing business within that. And I think that's something the state and the regulators probably have a really hard time digesting.
Yes. And I think that you bring up a good point about service companies that are here, especially ones or service companies that, like are national or global, like a Liberty. And I think that, it's interesting because we are a service again that we, I used to work at Anadarko and, built their mitigation program. And so really forged and built Urban for the environment here in Colorado. That is not the norm for a service company.
Absolutely
not. So
yep.
To look for service companies that are like, oh, there's social contention with oil and gas development, I'm going to go dump tens of millions of dollars into that. That is not, there isn't another Urban 2.0 that's coming in to fill if Urban was to leave here. So very, very valid points on your end there. And so I think that it is really critical that the governor and, really any state that's considering regulatory framework like what we are currently under here in Colorado, California is a great example. But you have to have some type of consistency. Otherwise, you are going to have businesses leave. And so, Liberty's based here, Urban's based here, but some of the smaller service companies that can pack up and move that are not Basin specific, they might not ride this out. And so that is something that needs to be at the forefront of the governor's mind when he, not that I would think that service companies are necessarily at the forefront of his mind. But I think that it's something that is really valid, is that we need to, it needs to be a part of the conversation, the consideration, because a lot of the service companies out there are not tied to this basin in the capacity maybe, or the commitment that Urban and Liberty is.
Absolutely. No, and I think that's a great, those are great points. And I appreciate you commenting on that. And Heidi, I absolutely appreciate your time. You have been a fantastic guest and really a different sort of take on sort of, in many ways, a different sort of take on ESG, but a unique business and a business owner in Denver. And so it is truly a pleasure. Really appreciate your time. And I'm sure we'll be chatting again in the future, and we would love to have you back. And I know she has a slug of other podcasts she's going to be on, but this is the first of the slug. So that's, is honored to have you.
No, I had a great time, really enjoyed the discussion, love the podcast. And so, I think it's great what you're doing, and it's really important that we're having these conversations because, the struggle is real for everybody, and we have to be really thoughtful of how we choose to rise to the occasion to continue to advocate for, sustainable development. And when I say sustainable development, I mean sustainable oil and natural gas development continually here in Colorado and the US. So I think it's going to be an exciting time to see as the global narrative has shifted so much in the last few months. So
absolutely.
Happy to be here.
Couldn't agree more.
Love to come back.
Awesome. Well, we will definitely have you back and appreciate it. So thanks, guys. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week. Bye.
Thanks.